everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, to kick this off, let's start by setting the scene for everybody.
Yeah.
Where are we with reshoring, and what does automation have to do with it?
Hey, good morning, everybody. So reshoring. So you may have read we're having some supply chain issues, some tariffs, and things that are sort of shaking up the global economy and the way that we move things around and build them, and where they get built and why. And so I'll take the politics out of that. It makes a very complicated supply chain even more complicated to make the goods and services that we build. And so what we see that as now as an opportunity, though, to actually rethink how things are actually assembled and put together and pull in automation in places where it hasn't been necessarily economically feasible or viable to date. And so hence, robotics and automation are like the perfect entry point whenever somebody starts shaking the bushes or shuffling the deck the way that reshoring has. And I think the other thing that's actually driving the need for not only reshoring, but for automation, once you do start the reshoring, is, in most of the Western countries, it really hollowed out our manufacturing base. So people are no longer able to build the things that they once did. They don't have the skills nor necessarily the desire to be back in assembly lines and manufacturing things.
Right.
And so ultimately, to get that productivity, to be able to build and be more sustainable, on your own shores, you do need to actually start to pull in the whole world of autonomy. And whether that's building things or moving them around, those are both like sort of the two atomic elements.
Yeah. So how's this going to work? Are we just making the same supply chains all over again, but in our neighborhoods?
I think not, and I think, so here's the basic overview of a supply chain really quickly, is something gets pulled out of the ground, turned into a piece or a part or an object, it gets refined, it gets painted, it gets moved to the next spot for some value-added process that happens to it, and then it gets assembled into another piece, and it gets a sub-assembly, and then ultimately, after hundreds of thousands of those moves on the chessboard, you have a car. And I think some of the pieces will always remain the same in terms of serious comparative advantage, economic advantage for somebody to build something, but otherwise most of those pieces are actually shifting around. And so we can't do it the same way. Like I said, we don't have the labor to actually do it, and ultimately you're not cost competitive if you're doing things like you were doing in the world of 1950 manufacturing, Fords and Buicks. It just does no longer scale, and it's not cost effective. And so hence the need to really rethink how we automate everything.
Right.
And I think automation is at a point now, and robotics is at a point now where I think it allows us to actually change everything.
Yeah. Well, we can't talk about automation and robotics for these purposes without talking about Amazon, right?
Yeah.
So, but I don't think it's really understood why besides just scale. So do you mind to paint that picture for us?
Sure. So for those who don't know, Amazon has done a really, really, really good job at automating almost everything they do. They have over 1 million robots actually out in their various warehouses running around doing productive stuff right now. That's more than every other company combined, and then some if you take out China. And so they are the leader by far, and they've sort of set the curve for what's possible. They did that by buying a robotics company in 2012 called Kiva. They've invested in it very heavily. They've designed their entire factories around automation. And so they sort of set the tone. For anybody who's not Amazon, up until now, it's very hard to follow that lead because you couldn't invest billions and billions and billions of dollars of CapEx. Right. You couldn't wait on a 10-year horizon to get those productivity gains. But now I think we're at a point where the world of robotics has changed so that these things are actually much more cost effective, much more highly functional in terms of the things that they can do, and multi-purpose so that they can actually serve multiple masters at the same time. And so I think ultimately the world of robotics has caught up. It has become more affordable and just I think a more mature world that then allows them to actually sell into these smaller clients who couldn't necessarily afford to make the investment that Amazon did. So I think everyone is now in catch-up mode, but I think the technology curve has actually allowed us to get to a point where it's actually pretty feasible.
Yeah. Well, to that end, so you're an investor, but you're also at a robotics company, and that's how you're here right now. So what is robust AI?
Yeah. So my background is an eclectic one, really briefly. So I began my career as a entrepreneur, technologist. I was lucky enough to be part of a video game company called Activision, where we were a bunch of young kids making games. And then I got a taste for doing creative technology, interdisciplinary stuff, and that's sort of carried through my whole career. And ultimately, after having built and run a lot of different companies as an operator, I found myself in this really interesting place where we saw more companies than any one of us could do. And my friends and I spun up a venture capital firm about a decade ago to be able to pursue more of them. And the thing that really interested us is these intersectional companies or these interdisciplinary companies where you have technology and science coming together to allow you to do things that were otherwise not possible in the past.
Right.
And so then we do things like in the world of health and wellness. We are investors in the Aura Ring, for instance, that allows you to take the science of sleep tracking and pull it into the, into the more consumer world. But in the world of robotics, we were always looking for something that was like really interesting and differentiated. And then we came across this one company called Robust, which we're now investors in. And it was a very different story. And it was, instead of robots actually taking jobs from people and trying to replace, one-for-one human functions, it was about robots augmenting humans, like actually sort of turbocharging what a person is capable of. And I think that paradigm, we call it a cobot or a collaborative robot, that paradigm really resonates with me. I think we're, like, as humans, we're sort of used to getting leverage on our time and energy and our physical workforce, right? And so, you went from drilling something manually to having a power drill. And so in the world of, supply chain, logistics, manufacturing, where you kind of build and move things, like, why not actually have sort of a toolkit where you can turbocharge people's abilities?
Yeah. Well,
So that's what Robust does, and I'll tell you more about it if, as we go on here.
Well, I'm curious, because in this whole cobot robot conversation, right, for industrial robots, where do you stand on the whole humanoid thing?
All right. I'll tell you what we built first, and then before I go into the humanoid diatribe. But so I think robots are going to come in a variety of form factors. There's going to be, I think, lots and lots of them. We're at this Cambrian explosion right now of robots being able to, like I said, kind of coming down that cost curve so they can do a variety of different things. I think also, if you look at the history of robotics, when they were more expensive and more brittle, you would have them do one very specific, tailored purpose, customized for that thing, because that object was so expensive and so, fragile in terms of its ability to actually change or do anything else. So you would have them doing spot welding or things. Now we're at a point where you can actually put enough compute power on top of the robot, like in NVIDIA Jensen, for instance. You can put enough sensing on those robots so they can actually, see what's going on around them visually, and have some spatial awareness and a semantic understanding of the world using AI. So all of this is powered by AI. I'd be shocked if you're going to see any talks today that don't involve some sort of AI. So I almost leave it as a given right now that AI is fundamental in sort of the field of robotics. But with these multi-purpose robots actually being able to run around, I think they're going to take a couple of different form factors ultimately in kind of these big surface areas, right? You'll have things that walk, like humanoids. You'll have things that fly or swim, and so going through a fluid, like drones. And then you'll have things that roll, like with wheels. And I think ultimately the problem that we saw that was most interesting was actually the wheeled form factor. Right. Those other ones are great, they're going to be interesting, but ultimately I just think the bulk of things that need to get done in our economy are sort of turbocharged by things that actually roll around and can carry large loads, do it quickly, on multiple different surface types, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of the problem set that we decided to solve. And then we said, okay, what can we do in the world of supply chain and logistics to actually really automate things, but do it alongside humans rather than trying to replace humans?
Right.
And so what we built is a cart. It looks just like a cart, so it's one of those anthropomorphic things that, like, it looks like what it does. And we call it Carter, so pun intended. And yet what it is, it's a supercomputer on wheels under the hood. And it was invented by the guy named Rodney Brooks, who is sort of a legendary roboticist. He created iRobot and the Roomba, way back when. He's been a professor at MIT forever. And pretty much everyone in the robotics field, has been a student of Rodney's at MIT at some point or other. So once Rodney came to us and said, here's what I want to build and here's why, it was sort of a no-brainer for us to actually invest in it.
Sure.
What was not expected was the fact that I got so deeply involved in the company that I actually joined the business as well. And so now I'm part of the management team actually helping to build and grow this company. Just the opportunity was too big and too exciting for a nerd like myself not to actually just jump in.
I think we should address the difference between the AI that most of us use every day, which is like this digital AI, versus the physical AI that we're talking about in these real world situations.
Yep.
Because I think it's rarely obvious just how different these things are. Do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. So like I was saying, AI is everywhere. Most people think about AI in the world of like LLMs or machine learning. It's all in the digital field.
Yeah.
Whenever you're in the world of robotics, you actually have to think about it in the physical world. So we call it physical AI, and it's different in a couple of different ways, right? One, it's not just LLMs. You're actually taking, cameras and using sort of visual learning or algorithms and other sort of similar techniques to do really interesting full-dimensional sensing. But nonetheless, there's two things that are just fundamentally different between digital AI and real world physical AI. The first one is the scaling laws are different. And so whenever you're looking at digital stuff, everyone gets excited because something's on an exponential curve, like Moore's law. Every couple of years, the amount of compute power will double, and that's predictable. It's happened for a long time, and that's enabled lots and lots of the stuff we do today. In the physical world, you have actual real things in the laws of physics and manufacturing that mean you can't just double stuff every year. You're not going to be able to half the size of a motor or double the power ratio of a battery every 2 years. And so you're on more of a linear curve. That's not to say it's not improving. It's not to say that it's not super exciting, because it is. But ultimately, it's more of a slow, steady pace that you play out here. And so that's the scaling laws. But then the other part is the reliability
of like the stakes
things.
are different.
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
The other
So
part
that's like the laws of physics part. But then the more important bit is the stakes are really high. And so if your LLM works 99% of the time, that's absolutely fine. But if your Waymo, your self-driving car, works 99% of the time and crashes 1% of the time, you have a real problem. And so the real question is, for physical AI, what level of reliability does it need to get to for people to be able to accept it, given the fact that you have real safety concerns? You can hurt or kill somebody with physical real-world systems. Yeah. And so just as a fun fact, in America, your average car will drive about 100,000 miles between crashes, call it rough justice. And it'll be about 1 million miles between fatal crashes. And so an AI, for it to take over from human drivers, needs to outperform that by a long shot. Because people are just more comfortable with humans, whether it's logical or not. That's just how we're wired. So that's sort of the default that people will fall to. So whenever you say okay, what reliability does Waymo need to get to? It's like 5 nines. It's way, way, way out there. And to do, if you take the old 80-20 rule, 20% of the work gets you 80% of the way there. But getting all the way out to that last 0.00001% reliability, it's really hard. And it takes a lot of time. And you just, very few systems need to be that level of reliability at that scale. And so, you have air traffic control systems and power grids, and these are all the things that you think about as real world AI in addition to robots. And so they just inherently move more slowly.
Yeah. That's my show this morning, actually. I've got Daniela Roos from MIT CSAIL talking about exactly this.
Oh, nice.
Hard-coded robots versus the statistical AI, and how we eventually find a way to put physics into a robot so we don't have to code everything.
Right. Totally. Absolutely. And I think to your question about humanoids, too, it's they're going to be super interesting. It's absolutely going to be a very viable product to have a C-3PO like humanoid robot that walks around and folds your laundry or whatever the use cases are. Although it's funny, whenever I talk to people, like the number one use case always does come up with folding your laundry, and it's like, is that really that big a problem that one needs a robot? But nevertheless. But I still think there's a lot of invention that needs to happen before they are able to do all the normal household things that we take for granted. Just by way of example, they're pretty good at locomotion at this point. They can kind of like stand on their own 2 feet and walk around and get pushed. But they can't really function in any way. And if you look at all the robot videos that are out there from the companies that are raising billions of dollars, super promising, super exciting. But you'll also notice that the humans are standing a little far away from the robots because they're still a little dangerous right now. And the robot actually can't pick an object out of the bag and pull it in. The human does that for it. And it can do a little bit of gripping, but it can't do any sensing or feeling yet. And so I think there's a few rounds of invention that still have to happen before we get really to like true humanoid form factors. So, they'll be around, but they're not going to be that functional for another decade, probably.
Right. I have an acquaintance with a humanoid in her home, and I would say it's a bit like having a puppy or a toddler. But as an investor deeply embedded in the robotic world, what's something you're watching over the next 2 to 5 years?
Oh, wow. I think there's going to be this explosion of special purpose robots, so things that are doing very bespoke things. You get things like Gecko Robotics that are doing power line inspections, and I think you're going to find more and more. It's kind of like in the olden days when software was new, you could only do things that were really mass market, and now that software is really easy to build and deploy and support, there's very niche applications that anybody can do, and you can even vibe code something for your own utility in the morning. At this point. And so I think in the world of robotics, it's going to be the same. It's going to be like, okay, we did the single purpose thing for like welding, and now we're doing the general purpose thing for all supply chain with Carter and Robust. But I think you're going to find it at the point where you can actually start to really get into these smaller niches that service really small markets because they're going to be cheap and affordable. And why are they getting affordable? Because you have these cost curves that are coming down. So you have the cost of motors and the cost of actuators is coming down because there's just more of them being produced. They're in things like hoverboards and scooters and all sorts of things in addition to robots. And so that's the traditional cost curve. The control software is getting more and more interesting. Sort of the sensing packages are also more commodity. You have an ADAS system on your car right now that does a lot of camera work and powers the self-driving bits or likes the autonomy bits. And so I think the cost curves are pulling us to a point where I think you're going to have robots everywhere, and it's going to be really exciting, and we're not that far away from it.
Awesome. Thank you very much for this. We are out of time. I can believe it already. Thank you all for being here this morning.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.